There are some fights that begin like thunder. You hear them coming. You feel the pressure in the walls. You know the sky is loading itself. And then there are the quieter ones. The kind that walk in on 4 short legs. The kind with a wrinkled face. A soft body. Warm breath. Tiny paws clicking across hardwood like nothing in the world could possibly be wrong. That was the dangerous part. Nothing looked wrong at first. If you had stood in that doorway and seen him, you would have smiled. Anyone would have smiled. A stocky little bulldog puppy, all folds and snorts and sleepy eyes, tucked under one arm like a prize somebody had won at a carnival designed by bad decisions. My husband looked proud. Not guilty. Not uncertain. Proud. Like he had done something sweet. Like he had brought home joy. Like he was waiting for me to burst into tears, throw my arms around him, and say this was exactly what our life had been missing. And maybe that would have happened in some other marriage. In some other version of me. In some softer story where the dog was healthy, the timing made sense, and both people in the room had made the choice together. But that is not the story that landed in my lap. Because I had spent years being careful. Years knowing what it actually means to bring an animal into your home. Years understanding that love is the easy part and care is the hard part. The waking up. The scheduling. The money. The cleanup. The training. The daily, unphotographed labor no one brags about because it is not cute enough for strangers. We had talked about getting a dog before. Not casually. Not in that dreamy, passing way people say we should have a dog someday. We had talked about it like adults. Like people who shared a life. Like people who understood that the word someday had to bow to reality. We traveled too much. That was the truth. And while I miss dogs, miss their steady companionship, miss the simple grounding weight of an animal sleeping nearby, wanting one was never enough. Wanting is cheap. Responsibility is expensive. Then his job changed. Not forever. Just for a while. Long enough that the travel slowed down and the idea came wandering back into the room. Maybe now. Maybe this year. Maybe if we were smart about the breed. Maybe if we chose carefully. Maybe if we did it as a team. That part mattered to me. As a team. Because some dogs fit your life. And some dogs demand that your whole life bend around them. And if you are not honest about that from the beginning, then what you call love can become a slow, smiling kind of neglect. I knew what I could handle. I knew what I could not. I had a list in my mind. And on that list were breeds I would never choose no matter how adorable people insisted they were. No matter how trendy. No matter how many photos online made suffering look charming. I knew what chronic breathing problems sound like. I knew what genetic shortcuts look like when they are packaged as personality. I knew that some dogs come into the world already negotiating with pain. So when I looked at that puppy, really looked at him, I did not just see cute. I saw a body already struggling. He snored when he was awake. Not metaphorically. Not a tiny funny snuffle. He breathed like every inhale had to fight its way through a narrowed tunnel. His little chest worked harder than it should have. His nose looked wrong. His movements looked careful. Even at 6 months old there were signs. The kind that are easy to ignore if you want the fantasy badly enough. My husband said a family could not keep him. He said it with the triumphant softness people use when they want credit for rescuing something. He told me the dog needed us. He told me he could not just leave him there. He told me, with that reckless certainty people borrow when they do something first and plan to apologize later, that he felt like he deserved a dog. Deserved. That word hit me harder than the dog did. Deserved. As if a living animal were a reward. As if devotion were a trophy. As if a heartbeat could be bought to celebrate a rough week. I remember staring at him and thinking that the room had tilted. Not dramatically. Just enough to make everything feel unfamiliar. Because I did not know where my husband had gone in the seconds between us discussing a future choice together, and him walking into our home with a permanent decision already panting in his arms. And what made it worse, what made it feel almost unreal, was that the puppy himself was good. That is how these things happen. If he had been wild, destructive, impossible, maybe I could have held on to my anger cleanly. Maybe outrage would have stayed simple. But he was gentle. Quiet during the day. Sweet in that guileless animal way that asks for almost nothing except closeness. He curled up near me while I worked. He followed warmth. He trusted instantly. And that made me furious in a different direction. Not at him. At the trap of him. At the fact that innocence had been used like a wedge in my marriage. At the fact that now, if I objected, I was not just objecting to my husband. I was objecting to a dog already asleep in my house, already breathing badly in my living room, already somehow becoming my problem. For the first few days, I tried to behave like a reasonable person. I asked questions. How much did you pay? What exactly did they tell you? Did a vet see him? What are we looking at here? The answers came in fragments. Soft ones. Slippery ones. The sort of answers that dissolve when you hold them too tightly. Yes, there were breathing concerns. Yes, someone had mentioned surgery. Yes, there might be joint issues too. Yes, his knees might need work later. Yes, this could all be expensive. Yes, maybe he should not run too hard. Yes, maybe I was overreacting a little because he was still just a puppy and maybe plenty of bulldogs were fine. That last one sat in the air between us like a lie neither of us wanted to label. Because I was not reacting to a mystery. I was reacting to a pattern already visible. A 6-month-old dog who should have been tumbling through life with stupid confidence was already carrying a medical future on his back. Soft palate surgery. Nostril surgery. Possible patella surgery. Not maybe never. Not distant hypotheticals. Real words. Real procedures. Real costs. Real pain. And my husband, who had made this choice alone, seemed far more interested in the fantasy of having the dog than in the architecture of keeping him alive well. He loved the public version of dog ownership. He loved carrying him into pet stores. Loved the attention. Loved the strangers who laughed at the snorting and called him adorable. Loved the glow that comes from being seen as the kind of man who shows up with a dog. What he did not love, apparently, was the private part. The walking. The cleaning. The repetitive, ordinary, unglamorous care. Weeks passed, and a pattern formed so fast it almost felt like it had been waiting to happen. I worked from home, so the dog drifted toward me by gravity. I was there. I heard him. I noticed when he needed something. I was the one present for the quiet evidence of living. That is how labor sneaks onto a person. Not all at once. Not with ceremony. Just one small need at a time until your day belongs to things no one assigned you, but somehow everyone assumes you will handle. I learned his rhythms. His sleepy stretches. The funny way he settled beside my chair. The sad sound of his breathing after even mild effort. The way guilt and tenderness can share the same body and make a home there. And every evening my resentment sharpened, because my husband would come home and want the sweet parts, the performative parts, the easy affection, the trip to the dog park, the stop at the pet store, the moments that looked like love from the outside. But when there was a mess to clean, somehow his timing slipped. When the dog needed a structured walk, he was tired. When there was routine to build, limits to set, consistency to offer, it all seemed to drift back toward me, the person whose great crime was being home where the consequences were visible. I do not think resentment arrives as heat first. I think it arrives as bookkeeping. You start counting. I cleaned that. I did this. I noticed that. I remembered the appointment. I adjusted the schedule. I watched the breathing. I worried alone. And then one night, the bed became the battlefield. He wanted the dog to sleep with us. Wanted it in that casual way people ask for things they have already decided to take. Like the question is just decoration. Like your answer is a courtesy he is extending to himself. I said no. Not because I hated the dog. Not because I could not handle fur or snoring or inconvenience. But because I needed one place in the house that still felt like ours. One place not colonized by his impulse. One place that had not been claimed by a choice I did not make. Also, selfishly, honestly, humanly, I could not listen to that breathing all night. In the daylight, when he slept by my desk, I could absorb it. At 3 in the morning, in the dark, with every rasp sounding like a body struggling through a tunnel it did not choose, it was unbearable. Not loud. Worse than loud. Intimate. I told him if the dog slept in the bed, I would sleep somewhere else. And he let me. That was the part one could not get over. He let me. No scramble to compromise. No, come on, let's figure this out. No, you matter more. No visible alarm that his wife was leaving the bedroom over a 3-night. Recognition is cruel. It does not burst in. It peels wallpaper. It shows you the shape of things that were always there, hidden under paint, hidden under routine, hidden under all the tiny accommodations that felt easier than naming what they cost. I began thinking about chores. Not because chores are dramatic, because they are not, because they are the background music of adult life. And if one person stops hearing it, the other one has to live inside the noise alone. The dog had exposed something ugly with surgical precision. My husband said owning a dog was a joint effort. He said that because I was home all day it should not be a problem. Something in me went still when he said that. Not explosive. Not theatrical. Still. Because I had heard that sentence before, just wearing different clothes. You're home. You can handle it. You're already there. You'll notice it first. It makes more sense for you to do it. It's easier for you. It's not a big deal. Cooking, cleaning, straightening, remembering, managing. I do not know exactly when those ideas took root in our marriage. I do not know when convenience became expectation. I do not know when my flexibility started being treated like infrastructure. But once I heard it in that sentence, I could hear it everywhere. And that realization was worse than the dog. The dog was a symptom with a heartbeat. What scared me was the possibility that I had been slowly turning into support staff in my own relationship and calling it love because that sounded prettier. We went to therapy. Not because we were on the brink of dramatic collapse. Not because dishes were being thrown. Not because one catastrophic betrayal had ripped the roof off the house. We went because quiet disappointment can be just as terminal when it is left untreated. Before the session, I tried to organize my thoughts. Not the emotional ones. Those were too big, too flooded, too likely to become a blur of accusation and pain. I needed structure. So I made a list. Not poetic. Not elegant. A list. Kitchen. Trash. Dishes. Counters. Dog. Feeding. Monitoring. Cleaning up. Scheduling. Thinking ahead. Holding the emotional burden of his health. Being the one who could not stop hearing every difficult breath. Bedroom. Boundary ignored. Request dismissed. Wife relocated. Marriage. Loneliness. Stress. The feeling of caring more than I could explain. The feeling that we were no longer a team. Just two people unevenly benefiting from my ability to keep things running. I do not know if you have ever had the experience of preparing yourself for battle, and instead discovering you have arrived at your own grief. That was therapy. I started speaking. I started listing. I started doing what calm women do when they are trying very hard to remain legible. And somewhere in the middle of a sentence I broke. Not loudly. Not beautifully. Nothing cinematic about it. Just a sudden collapse in my own voice. Because lists are dangerous when they are honest. They reveal totals. They add things up. They strip away the flattering blur. And as I heard myself say it all out loud, not as isolated irritations but as the architecture of my daily life, I understood how tired I was. I understood how lonely I was. That was the word that had been floating just beyond reach. Lonely. Not abandoned. Not unloved in the most literal sense. Lonely inside the relationship itself. Lonely while sharing a bed until I was not even sharing that. Lonely while doing the work of keeping a life moving. Lonely while watching the person I loved enjoy the comforts built from my labor without seeing the strain in my hands. I cried. And I was not a crier. Not really. My body did not usually choose tears as its language. There had only been a few times in my adult life when grief forced them through. The biggest one was losing a beloved cat years before. A pain so clean and final it had left a permanent quiet space inside me. So when I cried there in that office, my husband looked stunned, concerned, present. It struck me then how long it had been since I had felt held emotionally by him, instead of merely accompanied by him. There is a difference. I think people misunderstand what it means when a marriage begins to mend. They imagine a grand speech, perfect apology, a turning point so obvious you can circle it on a calendar and say, there, that was the day everything changed. But it rarely looks like that. Usually it looks like someone chopping vegetables at 6:30 because they said they would make dinner. Usually it looks like a leash picked up without being asked. Usually it looks like a body showing up on time, again and again until trust, that shy animal, begins inching its way back out from under the furniture. That was our life in those weeks. Small proofs. He came home earlier. He spent time with me, not just near me. We started watching our favorite shows again. Started going out more. started feeling less like coworkers managing a household and more like the couple we had once been before routine calcified into imbalance. And I changed too. That part matters. Because once you name a pattern, you cannot keep participating in it the same way without feeling yourself disappear. I started putting my foot down more. Not cruelly. Not theatrically. Just clearly. This bothered me. No, that does not work for me. Yes, I need you to do your share. No, my presence at home is not a vacuum into which all unclaimed labor should fall. It was awkward sometimes. New boundaries often sound rude to people who benefited from your lack of them. But he was receptive. More than receptive. He seemed to understand, maybe for the first time in full color, that what I needed was not occasional sweetness. It was partnership. Predictable, embodied daily partnership. And the dog, the little breathing crisis that had dragged this whole truth into daylight, changed too. Training helped. Structure helped. Consistency helped. Money helped if I am being honest. Not because money solves character. It does not. But because care costs, and it matters when an animal with complicated needs lands in a home that can actually meet them. He was still the dog I never would have chosen. Still the breed on my no list. Still the living example of everything I hate about people shaping animals into forms that struggle to simply exist. That did not vanish. I did not wake up one morning and decide all my convictions had been overdramatic. But he was also just him. A good puppy. A big heart. A creature who had not asked to be designed this way, bought this way, argued over this way. A creature who learned us faster than we learned ourselves. Who softened the room by sleeping in sun patches. Who stopped being an issue and started being a presence. That is what complicated everything. And maybe what saved something too. Because once the marriage steadied, once the dog was no longer functioning as a spotlight for every hidden imbalance, I could finally see him without the full shadow of resentment behind him. Not as evidence. Not as a symbol. Just as a dog. A needy one. A medically expensive one. A snorting, wrinkled little contradiction. But ours. I think about that often. How close love sits to inconvenience. How often care arrives in an undesirable form. How adulthood keeps asking the same humiliating question in 100 costumes. Can you tell the difference between the fantasy and the responsibility? And once the fantasy burns off, can you still stay for the responsibility? My husband had failed that test at first. Badly. He wanted the glow without the grind. The image without the infrastructure. The affection without the accounting. But then, to his credit, when the truth was laid bare, he did not keep hiding from it. He stepped toward it. And that matters too. People are always trying to sort each other into permanent categories. Good partner. Bad partner. Selfish. Devoted. Hopeless. Redeemable. Real life is uglier and more useful than that. Sometimes a person is loving and careless. Sometimes they are generous in one season and lazy in another. Sometimes they need to be shown the damage in language they cannot avoid. Sometimes they rise to it. Sometimes they do not. Mine did. Slowly. Imperfectly. Enough that I could breathe again in my own home. Enough that our bedroom felt intimate instead of contested. Enough that evenings no longer felt like a second shift I had to work while someone else received the benefits. Enough that laughter, that old familiar sound we had somehow misplaced, started finding us again in little domestic corners. The sink. So yes, we kept the dog. That is the kind of ending people tend to call heartwarming. And maybe it is. Partly. But I do not think warmth is the whole truth. I think the truer ending is steadier than that. Less glowing. More earned. We kept the dog because by then the question was no longer just, is this the breed I would have chosen? The answer to that remained no. A clear no. A principled no. The deeper question had become, can we care for the life that is here now? Can we do it responsibly? Can we do it together? Can this home hold all three of us without one person silently disappearing under the weight of everyone else's needs? For the first time in a while, the answer felt like maybe. Not because everything was magically fixed. Not because marriages are repaired with one good month. Not because a few dinners and walks can erase the bruise of being dismissed in your own home. But because the direction had changed. And direction matters. He was trying. Consistently. Tangibly. Not in the cheap language of intention, but in the costly language of habit. The only language trust really believes. We were still in therapy, still talking, still learning how to notice the small ways imbalance sneaks in before it becomes normal, still remembering that love is not proven by how passionately you feel in the best moments. It is proven by how honestly you correct yourself when your comfort has been built on someone else's quiet overextension. The dog would always need more than average. That was simply true. He would need money, monitoring, accommodation. There would be surgeries and worries and limits, and all the invisible math that accompanies a fragile body. But he would also have us. Not the version of us that existed when he first arrived. Not the brittle version. Not the careless version. A better one. A more awake one. Sometimes I would look at him sleeping, those dramatic little breaths, that absurd squashed face softened by complete trust, and feel two emotions at once. Sorrow and tenderness. Sorrow for what had been built into him before he ever had a say. Tenderness for the fact that he was here anyway, loving with the whole of what he had. Maybe that is part of marriage too. Not the bulldog part. The paradox part. The part where love does not erase your objections. Where compassion does not require you to pretend nothing was wrong. Where two truths can occupy the same room without strangling each other. I still hated the way he came into our lives. I still hated what that moment revealed. I still hated that it took a crisis for us to say aloud what should never have gone unnamed for so long. And yet, I loved the way truth, once spoken, rearranged the house. I loved the sight of my husband coming home earlier because he wanted to be with me, not just because he wanted points. I loved seeing him learn the dog instead of posing beside him. I loved that our bedroom became ours again. I loved that the dog had his own bed. I loved the ordinary evenings returning like cautious birds. I think, if I am honest, the thing that haunts me most is not that he bought the dog. It is how close I had come to treating my own unhappiness as something reasonable to absorb forever. That is the chilling part. The almost. The version of me that might have kept doing the work, kept sleeping in the guest room, kept telling herself this was temporary, manageable, not worth a real confrontation. The version of me that might have confused endurance with peace. I am grateful I lost patience before I lost myself. And maybe that is the final shape of this story. Not a woman learning to love a dog she never wanted. Not even a marriage saved by therapy, though therapy mattered. It is a story about interruption. About the moment a life can no longer proceed on autopilot, because something undeniable has entered the room. Something breathing too hard. Something costing too much. Something making visible what was once easy to blur. And then the choice. To harden. To flee. To dominate. To resent forever. Or to look straight at what has been revealed and begin, clumsily, unglamorously, to rebuild. We rebuilt. Not into something brand new. Into something more honest. A marriage where home no longer meant my automatic labor. A marriage where being physically present in the house did not make me the default keeper of every loose end. A marriage where my no meant something. A marriage where his love had to grow up and put on work boots. A marriage where a dog slept in his own bed. And two people slowly found their way back to each other. If you ask me now what changed us, I could say therapy. I could say communication. I could say the list. I could say the tears. But somewhere in the middle of all those true answers is one more. A bulldog puppy, snoring like a tiny broken engine, arrived at our door carrying a problem my husband thought was simple. He was wrong. It was never just a dog. It was the sound of everything we had postponed hearing. And once we heard it, really heard it, there was no going back to the quieter lie. Only forward. Only the hard mercy of paying attention. Only the ordinary miracle of two people deciding that love, if it is going to survive, must become visible in the chores, the boundaries, the bedtime, the walks, the dinner, the listening, the return. And somewhere nearby, under the table or in a patch of afternoon light, a dog breathing exactly as he breathes. Still imperfect. Still loved. Still here.